Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Two great friends of the show on today. Glenn Greenwald will be here remotely anyway to talk about Brazil. Bolsonaro has coronavirus, so what is going on there? We have Brianna Joy Gray back on the show to talk about the Bernie Unity Task Forces and also Biden once again introducing the concept of going back into TPP. But we wanted to start with some big SCOTUS decisions yesterday and some very confusing responses to those decisions.
Yeah, it's a very strange cases happening here. So the first one, obviously the one that's been all over cable, the Supreme Court upholds New York prosecutors' access to Trump's tax returns and it rebuffs Congress. Now that is, something we've been watching for a long time. We should remember, though, that the court they blocked the House's attempt in order to try and get Trump's tax returns. It only affirmed that the New York New York Attorney General could have access to Trump's tax returns as a result of a law that was passed in the New York State Legislature requiring tax return disclosure for anybody who is running for president of the United States. So that is actually the facts of the case. I mean, it's been interesting because on the right, I actually see a pretty big split on this, right? Like the Trumpists, like people who are truly loyal to Trump, are like, this is a disgrace. Why are Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Roberts all ruling against Trump? But look, I definitely fall on the other side of this, which is when you're president of the United States, leader of the free world, and if you're a billionaire, I think you should have to disclose your tax returns. If you have a vast financial empire, we have absolutely no idea what influences you have in terms of your money, and transparency is always better than nothing, because if you're running against corruption, you have to be for full transparency and against corruption in all cases. Yeah. And Joe Biden, which is why I think that the conservative justices ruled this way, could be president of the United States. He's got a lot of sketchy dealings. How much money is he getting from his brother, from his son? Is he getting any? Wall Street speeches, all these other things. I would personally really like to know that. I think the American people would too. So I'm kind of an absolutist on this. It's going to piss off a lot of the Trump people, but I don't really care.
But no, your point is really important, because we talk all the time here about the corruption of money in politics and the financial interests that are underlying people's decision making. And so if you can shield all that from the public, then we have no idea whose interests you actually are serving, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Joe Biden, whether it was, in an alternative universe, Hillary Clinton or others. And so with this decision, part of why the response to it was very mixed all the way around is because, number one, as you pointed out, on one case they rule, against Congress, basically saying, yes, you can get these documents, but you didn't provide a good enough reason here.
A limiting principle.
Exactly. And on the other hand, they ruled in favor of New York and the prosecutors there, subpoenaing the tax returns, saying basically, look, you're not above the law because you're president, which is what the president had tried to argue is basically you can't subpoena my tax returns. I'm basically immune as long as I'm in this office. The Supreme Court said, no, you are not. This is appropriate. They can subpoena your tax returns. Now, that does not mean that we are going to see the president's tax returns anytime before November. In fact, it is almost certain that we will not see the tax return. So as a practical matter, in terms of actually getting that information and seeing where those financial interests lie, we're not going to. In addition, now the case that the Supreme Court did rule, it's okay to subpoena the president's tax returns, it goes back down to a lower court where, just like any other citizen, the president will have the right to argue why that's inappropriate in this particular case. But basically the principle of you are not above the law if you're a president is what we got on here. Now, the way I look at this is this court loves to kind of split the difference.
That's all they do.
That's all let's rule really narrowly. And so I kind of see that same dynamic here, where it's on the one hand, they get to kind of portray themselves as politically independent. On the other hand, as a practical matter, it doesn't actually change anything that we're going to get before November. So they get to pretend to be independent and demonstrate that we're not just political hacks here. But in reality, it doesn't actually change anything.
I talked to a lot of SCOTUS watchers, and basically the way they look at it is they can read the news just like everybody else. They're terrified about the country, right? And they think, Roberts in particular, is afraid. He does not want to split the country in half, and he knows that there is a sizable court-packing effort from the progressive left, which is coming straight at him, right? So he is trying to split the difference. Him, Ginsburg, and Kagan, kind of like the centrists of the court, are basically teamed up together to say, hey, let's not issue any bombshell,
not go too
like
crazy here.
gay marriage level type decisions, which could just cleave the country in half. And, people will be like, it would just cause a real groundswell of political support either way, which you don't want to be in if you're one of them.
Thinking about that, which is a really, I think, accurate point, because they like to pretend like they're just there calling balls and strikes, and they're not subject to the whims. They're reading the news. They are very, if you have gotten to that level, the highest level of American elite government, you know about politics, you know how to play the game, you know how to read the tea leaves, you know all of that. And so I think the fact that progressives have made court packing and let's change the composition of the Supreme Court and gotten aggressive about that has put pressure on this court to make some rulings that are more in favor of the left, of Democrats, of liberal principles than they may have otherwise. So that political pressure may actually have been fairly successful.
No, it's been very successful. And actually, Trump spoke to a little bit of that dynamic that you were talking about. He's like, look, we're just going to go fight this thing in the lower courts. Let's take a listen.
Well, the rulings were basically starting all over again, sending everything back down to the lower courts, and you start all over again. And so from a certain point, I'm satisfied. From another point, I'm not satisfied, because frankly, this is a political witch hunt, the likes of which nobody's ever seen before. It's a pure witch hunt. It's a hoax, just like the Mueller investigation was a hoax that I won.
Okay, standard issue talking points there. I do want to point out, with regards to going back down to the lower court, like I was just saying, where he now, as any citizen can fight that subpoena and basically say, you don't need my tax returns for this case. Prosecutors very likely to win that particular. Those are very easy battles to win in a court. So probably eventually those tax returns will come out. But again, it'll be after November. So in a way, from a practical matter, this is a win ultimately for Donald Trump. It was interesting on Fox News. We've been sort of following the way that they've been covering the president in this era. Yesterday we played, Brian Kilmeade smacking down Hogan Gidley over like, you're better off this time. Well, Andrew Napolitano was basically like, this is not a win for the president the way that some are portraying it. Let's take a listen.
So this is a defeat for the president, because ultimately, and Starwalt can weigh in on this better than I can, ultimately this might not affect the election, but it certainly will affect the president's peace of mind, because he knows at some point his bitter nemesis, who's conducting a criminal investigation of him, Cy Vance, a criminal investigation predicated on the testimony given to Vance by the president's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. Eventually, that's going to go forward. Whether it happens before November or after November is a question of whether the courts can get all this done.
Yeah, Judge Knapp basically giving the same analysis there, but I think it is.
Judge Knapp, is that what people call him?
Yeah, that's what people call him.
Oh,
that's what the Fox News faithful call him. You can see my old right-wing hat going on here. So, that's what he's basically said there is the same thing. It is a defeat. But I don't even know if we should look at it as a defeat of the president, because all it is if you read the, I think it was the dissent, or the opinion from the court, they're like, look, from the beginning of the republic, the term everyman has applied to the president of the United States.
Every man.
That is just kind of like what every man means under the letter of the law since the very beginning of the republic. So that's kind of where we are. I do think it is funny, because all of this aside, it has lit the flame of resistance liberals more than I have ever seen in the last year.
This is a big statement.
So, of course, to prep for the show, I go on Twitter and I look for, what's trending. And I see Mueller with like 60,000 retweets. I'm like, oh, this is going to be good. So what's going on here? So I click on it. And, of course, we have Max Boot, who has one of the top tweets here. He says, makes Mueller's decision not to subpoena Trump for his testimony even more misbegotten in retrospect. And all of these liberals on Twitter are freaking out, because they're like, the Supreme Court would have sided with Trump. They should have subpoenaed him. They should have gone after his tax returns. They should have taken him down. And it's just so funny, because it's the same thing. They're like, oh, if only he had done his job like this. I've witnessed some like real crazy bloodthirst in the last couple of days. Like, on Manafort. They're like, if kids can go back to school, we have to throw Paul Manafort back into prison. Or like Michael Cohen being sent back into prison yesterday. Everybody was cheering. Same with Roger Stone. They're like beating the drums in order to get him there. And you pointed this out. It's like they're for criminal justice reform for everybody except like Trump's, political cronies.
It's a little selectively applied.
What? They want him to some life in prison for like a process crime on legal issues, but everybody else is like, no, we can't do that.
On the Mueller thing, maybe, just maybe, you should have thought about this before you vested all of your hopes and dreams for taking down Donald Trump in a guy who's like a lifelong Republican, and like institutionalist, by the book, standard issue dude, who was ultimately, not the aggressive white knight hero that you thought he was going to be. And look, I kind of agree that he should have subpoenaed Trump. And I think, as we said, Russiagate was obviously ridiculous. But on the idea of the conflicts of interest, which was not really the thing that they were going after, I would have liked to have been able to have that information ultimately. But they just can't let the Russiagate stuff go. And there's this mentality that everybody's just got to get over. I've been thinking about this a lot from the beginning of the Trump administration, that it was like there was going to be this one silver bullet, like the shoe was going to drop any day now. And a lot of this was really ginned up by cable news, by the Rachel Maddows of the world, who really led their audience to believe that that was the case, that any day the next shoe was going to drop, he was going to be exposed as the Russian asset and the Manchurian candidate or whatever it was that you believed any moment now. And they're like still holding on to that. And then there was this corresponding belief that the fact that the American people weren't changing their opinion of the president
was because they needed more.
Was because they just didn't understand, right? They didn't get it. Obstruction of justice is just too complicated for them to understand. When the Washington Post put out their graphic novel of the Mueller report, just like,
which they printed money off of.
But now we see, and we're going to cover this later in the show, no, the American public is very capable of evaluating this president's performance. Yes,
on stuff that matters.
Yes. And so as he's failing to respond to the coronavirus crisis, as he's had this very, divisive response on the George Floyd protests, actually opinions are changing about him. Yeah, he's got a core base, just like any president has a core base. Yes, they are particularly fervent in certain cases, but a lot of people are able to think for themselves. And so this portrayal of the electorate that they were just like dumb automatons and that nothing mattered ultimately turns out to be not true, because we see the numbers moving now when, as you point out, it's something that they actually care about and is a true, problem with his leadership, and also is something that they didn't already know, which is one of the other, like, oftentimes the attacks like the Mary Trump book, it's stuff that you're like, I already know that about him.
That's the thing. You have to treat people with more respect. That's what the media just doesn't do, which is that they don't focus on the issues that actually matter to their lives. The moment, coronavirus, which is like a mortal threat to some elderly people and affects how we all conduct commerce and live our social lives.
Every single day.
People care a lot about how somebody handles that one, which we will show you in the polling data.
Yes, and they don't need a graphic novel to figure it out either. All right, we're going to tell you what's on our radars. That's next.